Let me just start so I can get it on tape. Your name is?
Thomas C. Nelson. My call name or nickname is Tomcat.
Tomcat, right? T-O-M.
Yes, T-O-M. But I did not care for my middle name, so when people would ask me what my middle initial was, I'd say C as in cat. So pretty soon Tomcat became. So I use that on all my, everybody knows me out the airport as Tomcat, sort of thing.
Well, it's funny because when I saw the name Tom Nelson,
There's a chief of police around here somewhere with the same name as I have.
Oh, is that right? Well, somewhere I had seen your nickname, and I said, I wonder if that's Tomcat, because I had seen your nickname. I don't know if one of the articles.
Well, see, I got a display. I don't know. It's at the airport with pictures and a lot of the documents that you're just talking about.
That's
now.
where I saw it.
Probably saw it there, yeah.
And in the service, if there's, I understand that everybody alphabetically, and if there's two of the same name, then it's initials, and so.
Oh yeah, I do all kinds of. Yeah.
Well, so where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Mill Valley, California, which was a suburb, you might say, of San Francisco, north end of the Golden Gate Bridge, about 6 miles from the bridge there. So, born in Oakland, California, on leap year.
So, on leap day or just leap year?
Leap day.
Oh, really? So you're only like 10 years old or something like that?
Well, I'm 20 now. You're going to want to check and see if I'm on board this tape, or is it working?
It's working, yeah.
Oh, okay, good. I know we're kind of batting around here a little bit, but no, I grew up, my first inklings were in Mill Valley when I was my first remembrance of anything was when I was 2 years old. And I remember, asked my parents when that happened. They said, oh my God, I don't believe you were just only 2 years old when that happened. But we were moving to a new house, you know how that kind of affects you, and I kept asking when they're moving to the new house and everything. But I do remember that myself. And then from then on is a kind of a blur. I remember when my brother was born, when I was 4 years old, that of course was a traumatic experience for everybody. And so forth and so on. But I went through all the local schools there in Mill Valley, the grammar schools. Summit School is long gone, torn down. Old Mill School, graduated at 8th grade in 1933, December. An odd part of the year, I skipped a low 5th, went to high 5th. I was just too dang smart, I guess. Which I caught up with me later on, I'll tell you. Some of the other subjects were not good. And I graduated from there, and I went to the local high school there, which was Tamalpais Union High School. And today, it kind of bothered me. They're eliminating all these logos like the Indians and all that stuff. And that was our big deal, because the story went, and the view of Mount Tamalpais, actually the silhouette shows a maiden, and they named Tamalpa. So Tamalpais was a very nice name and very honorable. So I can't see why these people today are screwing everything up and eliminating these names that had a real purpose. So naturally the logo was a Indian with full headdress sort of thing. Anyhow, I graduated from there in December of '37, and didn't like the idea of going up to starting college then. So I went back and took a postgraduate course. And mainly it got subjects that I wanted to take that they wouldn't let me take before. So I was 5 hours drafting every day, plus trigonometry, plus senior English, plus Spanish. I had to complete 2 years of foreign language to be able to go to college in those days. So I graduated from that and essentially got out in June of 1940 and went over to the University of California in August of 1940. Well, along in about September, October that year is when they started the draft. And I had joined the reserve back in 1938. Being a radio operator, I had an amateur radio license. The Navy was anxious to get trained people. So I went to the Navy today they go by rank, like E4. I went in as an E4, which was a radioman 3rd class. But I was green as they could make them, of course, because I didn't go to boot camp or nothing. So I went on 2 summer cruises on battleships. I spent 2 weeks on the USS Tennessee, And all he did there was cruise around the San Francisco Bay area and outside the area a few miles. And then the following year, I was on the Oklahoma. I made a cruise down to Southern California and did some gunnery and practice down there. And that was 1939. Meantime, I was in college. I went to what was then called Marine Junior College. Excuse me. I was studying engineering and graduated from there in June of 1940. As I sort of jumping the story, but I was a little back up there. So I was over at Cal Berkeley in engineering when the Navy called me to active duty on the day after Christmas, 1940. I reported, I had already received a physical exam. They determined I was disgustingly healthy. So I was on active duty. Next thing I knew, I was doing the San Francisco routine there. They had us there at the receiving ship, which at that time was called Yerba Buena, or Goat Island, right out in the middle of the bay there, attached to the Treasure Island site where the World's Fair had been. The Navy didn't take over Treasure Island until somewhat later. So we were living there in the barracks underneath the bridge where the trains whipping back and forth. But fortunately, I was able to get off just about every night and go home to, by bus and what have you, to be with my future wife, okay? We had a stunt we pulled there. It was kind of unique, though. Every Monday morning, we would go down and bet the yeoman, who was like a secretary, that we wouldn't be there next Monday. And we'd give him bet a couple of bucks or something. And he'd say, "What's your name?" And he'd put you down at the bottom of the list. So I went on for 4 or 5 weeks. Finally, the chief that had us working on these details began to think that too many faces were hanging around too long. So he went down, hauled all our papers out, put them on top of the pile. So the next day or two, we were on our way up to Mare Island on a tugboat and for transportation to Hawaii. I was put on the destroyer 365, the Cummings, and we left San Francisco Bay Area, and I was standing back near the fantail where the depth charges were located, and when the ship hit the first swells outside the Gold Gate, I got my feet wet up to my knees because she was already doing the pitching, and she already took water, and it came right up for her. Next thing I know, I was up to here in water. So I got my feet wet before I even hardly get outside the Golden Gate.
Was that your first, because you talked about some little cruises and stuff like that, yeah. But was that your first starting to see what the Navy was going to be like?
Well, I was on those 2 battleship cruises, so it wasn't quite, but it was much different on a little destroyer, though, compared to a battleship. A lot more motion, and everything. And the ship had been...
What was the attitude at this point? I mean, you'd been called into duty, and now you're sent over to Hawaii, which we know in retrospect is famous. But was it just kind of, well, we're out on another cruise and going to go do some work?
Well, because of the war situation in Europe, things were starting to heat up a little bit. I think they were getting a little bit worried. We had that deal where we gave the Britons 50 destroyers for that Lend-Lease swap, they call it, or something. Okay. Things were getting, and they had the draft that was underway, so we were starting to build up, actually, in anticipation of something going on. So it's a good thing they were working on that idea anyway. But we were, the reserve unit I joined there in San Rafael was a communication reserve, and we would actually communicate by code, or CW as it's called, to all the other, we had a whole string of stations up the coast of California there, all the different cities, like we were in San Rafael, then they had Santa Rosa, Petaluma, clear up to Eureka. Had about 5 or 6 stations there. And our main station was right there in San Francisco, the main base there. So we did a lot of, every night we did a lot of, every Monday night we did a lot of practice with the code and everything. And of course, having had the amateur radio license, that was old hat to me, I say. But it was good training. So, well, when I got out to, we got on this destroyer, we went down to Southern California and spent about 3 or 4 days down there going through the, they had the degaussing gear on the ship that would make the ship appear to be neutral, non-magnetic, to a magnetic mine. And all these wires that went around the ship, I don't know, they were like a figure eight all over the ship. And they had to be all set up and tuned perfectly, so they kept running you through this course to see, and then they would make another change. And well, that went on for 2 or 3 days there off San Pedro. And we finally got, and we thought, well, we're going to have liberty tonight. No. We got through the exercise that day. They head due west. So we were gone. Well, on the way out there, we hit 2 storms. And I think that darn destroyer was going to make out more like a submarine than a destroyer, because it was really, really putting their nose into the water and green water. About 99% of the crew was seasick because they'd been in port so long. And I wasn't feeling too good, but I never did feed the fishes, so I guess I survived that. We got to Pearl, and I was transferred to, my assigned ship was the USS San Francisco, a heavy cruiser, and routine duty. We arrived there about, I think it was Valentine's Day, February 14 or thereabouts. And I was fortunate in a way because I had relatives there. A cousin and my dad had some relatives there, and I got a hold of them, so I was able to get overnight liberty occasionally when I had the time off on a weekend or something. But most of the time it's pretty much routine. The Radio Shack, you got up there and you copied the code and typed out what you heard, and I never did care for that. I never became a touch typer, and today I have one heck of a bad time with my computer and so forth, because my fingers are so, you can see these bends and everything. I go to hit it, every time I go to hit something, I hit the one next to it, so it's a good thing I don't touch type, I guess.
What's the code like? I mean, how is it verbally coming in, or are we getting?
No, it's like like an A is da-da, short, long, da-da, da-da-da-da-da.
So you got to take all that in.
Oh yeah, I can. Once you know the code, well, you hear the code, and a lot of times you can anticipate what the word's going to be. As you get a little bit of it, and you just wait for the ending. But when they're sending out coded messages, like that have been coded, you just get 5-letter word groups. I mean, groups of 5 letters, all mixed. Now they have to put that into the code machine and whip it out and it convert it into plain text so you can understand it. So they were all decoded, and then after we got them on the ship, they would put them in the machine. So you had to be accurate on those X, Y's, and Z's and so forth, your P's and Q's, in other words. But I'll tell you, that got old after a while. And they use the same thing with the signal lights. You've seen the lights on masts, blinking away. Well, that's doing the same thing. That's doing the same code, Morse code. A is da-da. Well, I could read the lights too. And one time we were coming back from Liberty, and I saw our ship out there. I saw some ship. I was reading the message to myself, and by God, if it wasn't a telegram being sent to me. So I read the whole thing as I was going. We got out to the ship, and they said, "Oh, you got a message?" I said, "Yeah, I know." So they gave me the hard copy of it. But anyway,
where's your station on the ship? Where did you physically operate from?
Well, Radio 1 was what they called it. They had Radio 1. It was up just under the bridge, and then Radio 2 was the transmitting area, which was back behind the hangars where the airplanes were kept. Well, after about 3 months of this, it got awfully old, and one morning they had me go down to the sick bay for an examination. I asked them, "What's this all about?" "Well, we're checking you out for submarines." I said, "Oh no, I don't want submarines." They said, "Oh, okay. Well, you got to be a volunteer, so that wiped that out." Darn, I wasn't down there a week later though. Same doctors and everything. Said, "Weren't you down here last week?" "Yeah." "What's this for?" "Well, aviation." I had a chance to transfer into the aviation division. So that's what I did. I said, "I don't mind being above the water, but I just don't like being underwater." So I started working in the seaplanes, and we had those biplanes with a single float that would be catapulted, and when you landed, you'd land in the water, and the ship would make the proper turn or whatever to smooth out the ruffle in the water, and you'd come in and land on the first swell and bounce, and then taxi up and engage the bottom of the float had a kind of a hook under there that would come up and engage itself on that rope net that they were dragging on the sled, and you come and get hooked up with a sled, and then you'd be towed along with the ship. And then in my case, I had to climb out of my behind the pilot and climb up and straddle him and open a little hatch on top of the wing and pull out this little eye hook, and then they lower the crane down. This hook would be swinging around, and I'd grab it finally and put it into the eye there, and then that was only single block though. If you should happen to slip off the sled, they could cut the rope so it wouldn't hang you up, because it's very dangerous to have a plane go back like this and then suddenly be jerked up. It would just do this to it. So if everything was okay, then they'd two block you. Then you couldn't get away. Then they would bring you up. As soon as you were hooked up and being lifted, you had to jump back to your cockpit and unlimber some handling lines that were in there. And as you came up over the catapult, you'd toss those lines out, and the handlers would grab those lines so they could, because when a ship under its way 15, 20 knots, of course, it generates a breeze, even though and usually they head into the wind, so you get a lot of very awkward. So the handling lines would settle the plane so they could lower it down and put it back on the catapult or back down on the well deck between the catapults. Actually, we had 2 catapults on the ship, and we could get all 4 planes off in a matter of very few minutes. The 2 of them that were on the catapults would be revved up, ready to go, and they'd aim one out, and the ship was rocking or rolling, and they always hit it. So as you were starting on the upring, that's when they'd shoot you. They didn't shoot you down into the water, they'd shoot you up in the sky. And so they could shoot that one, and then she would then train, and then the other one would shoot the other side. Then they'd go ahead and reload the other planes on the other, and then shoot them off. So we'd have 4 planes in the air most of the time. And
what was scarier, taking off or getting picked up? Because as you described it, I imagine this ship's doing this, and you got ropes coming down, and planes and water, and
well, the catapulting was never any problem. I didn't think we never lost any planes on catapulting. We lost a few physically on the pickup, but I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. How we lost one out there during a battle because the guy jumped over the sled and got ahead of it, and a rope caught up with him and tore the wing float off. So the plane just turned right over and went upside down. So the pilot and the ray, when they were out there, I was sitting on the float. The destroyer came zooming up and launched a little small, I don't know, it was a lifeboat or what it was, and they chopped holes in the float, let it sink, picked the guys up, and they got back aboard ship shortly after that. But
two-person crew, right? You and
there was only 2 persons in that SOC type plane. Well, photographers taking pictures of some of this, so you'll see what that is. Those planes were biplanes, meant 2 wings. They could fold back, so they'd go fold clear back for storage purposes. We could store. We always had an extra one stored in the hangar that way, and then we had the 4 operating planes. Well, one interesting thing that I used to do, I had the record of getting on the air faster than anybody else, because we had most of the time we used a trailing wire antenna, which meant we had to trail out about 175 or 165 feet or so of wire, which had a 2-pound lead weight on the end of it. So the line would go out from the plane and go down and then kind of droop down like this. Well, that became the right amount of antenna length to resonate with your transmitting frequencies. So, but you had to slip the brake off and let the thing spin, watch the counter, and then you slow the brake down and stop it, and then adjust a foot or 2 either way with a crank on the drum there. Well, I used to loosen the brake just enough so it was barely holding that weight. So when that 20 pounds of black powder went off behind you and you started forward, you had to lean forward, you had the hooks like this, you come up, I'd kick the brake off. But by the time the plane got to the end of the catapult, I already had about 20 foot out, and the guys knew when I was in that plane not to be on that side of the catapult, because that lead weight would stand still for a little bit, and then it would start to move. So, but I would be on the air, and I already had the transmitter warmed up, and I would, in 9 seconds I would be on I would be hitting the key to call on the ship.
And so what was your job? I mean, you were up looking for...
Well, it was a scouting and observation plane. They used to go out and observe, like when any of the ships were doing gunnery, like shooting the big rifles they had on the battle wagons, or even our own. You would be out there watching and spotting the landing, how far, how near, how left or right, whatever, on what to do to hit the target. You'd report that back. Also, if you were out and you spotted enemy type of thing, it was all coded. The pilot would look at it. He'd have an overlay sheet and make little circles where we're reporting what was there. And he'd hand you a sheet of paper, and then you'd send that message. It was all just in codes, and you didn't know what it meant, but he did. And the ship, of course, would then decipher it, and that would be the battle report or whatever it was. Okay.
So are you on a specific... Because you had
a specific frequency.
So you got like 4 planes up, so you got 4 people on your ship receiving signals, or...
Yeah. All 4 planes were doing the same thing, and sometimes we'd have a whole squadron of 6 ships. We'd have 24 planes on the air. And that was fun, too. I used to be insidious again because we used to use what they call Z signals, ZAA, ZAB, ZAC, and so forth. There was a sequence of 2 or 3 signals that would say, "Attention all units, answer up roll call in numerical order." And so you'd send out, and then you'd just sit back, and as each one, you had to wait. The whole 24 had to check in that way, see? So you could just sit back and do nothing for a few minutes while they were all checking in. You had to keep a big old ledger book there. You had to write all the data in there and so forth. And that was fun. Then they also were out there looking for submarines. Anytime a task force was moving, these planes were out flying ahead of the task force at about 1,100 feet elevation. And you could see pretty deep in the water at that elevation. A submarine looked like a big brown cigar. We actually had practice with those sort of things. And we'd be, say, about 3 ships and 3 subs would be out there. And they'd be in there trying to do your ship, and you'd be looking for them. If you spotted them, you'd drop one of those smoke floats, which was about that long, mostly wood. It had a charge inside where they would send out smoke for about 5 minutes. And it just felt just right between here and here, the fins and the nose. And you could take that thing out and like that, and that thing would just go like this, just like a bomb would go right down. When it hit the water, it would start the smoke. Well, one day I saw that sub down there, so the pilot dove down. I did this, and I was watching it, and just about that time, the sub put up his periscope. And when he looked, probably, he just saw our plane literally coming like this. Man, he pulled that thing down quick. I don't think I missed his scope by more than 5 or 6 feet. So...
Because you're pretty low. I mean, even at your observation deck, that's pretty low. What do you say, 1,100 feet or something?
1,100 feet above water, yeah.
That's not very high.
No, that's true. But that's where we did our best work, I guess. That plane was not designed for real high elevation type work anyway. And our top speed was like maybe 120 or something like that knots. But in a vertical dive, we were a screaming dive, we were doing about 200. And I noticed all the antennas on this would go slack, wings would kind of lay back a little bit. Well, it was tricky. There were a couple of times when we almost bought it because of accuracy. One time, and when we go out for target practice, which is one thing we're doing all the time just before Pearl started, one plane would carry the target, which you'd tow behind the big, like a sock, with about 800 feet of nylon, or no, it was hemp line behind you, and the other planes would use that as their target to shoot at. And they had all kinds of runs you went through. Well, when I had, they would mark your projectiles. We had 30 calibers there with a paint, different colored. And they would, when you get the target back, when you cover the target, they'd count up and see how many holes had red or blue or green, whatever the paint color was, and that gave you your score. And always had a pool, whoever did the best, that sort of thing. So it was fun. And my pilot used to always give me a good shot at it. Sometimes that target would be that big, you could just see, you could almost write your name in the target there. But
so who did did the pilot do the flying and
you did you were in the rear cockpit. It had this 30 caliber that could aim anywhere. See, you just didn't want to shoot your own tail off. That's the main thing. But Now he did his own. He had a single 30 caliber straightforward that shot between the prop. In fact, one day one of the thing got out of sync and the prop ended up with a bullet stuck in it like this, so they had to rechange it. But
and you always flew with the same pilot, right?
not necessarily. No, most of the time I was with the same pilot. In fact, the first time they took me up, they tried their damnedest to get me sick, and I didn't. Spoiled their fun, spoiled their day, you know. Because anytime you made a mess like that, you had to clean it up. So it was not very pleasant, and it did happen.
How much movement? Because you're talking about you're coding in, and it sounds like you're writing in a log. Is there much room in your plane?
Not much. It's about so wide, just not much wider. There was a kind of an arm here where the key was located on there. So you hit the key here, and so the pilot was doing a lot of this sort of thing. One day I was going duh, you know, long dash because I was pulling out of a dive. My hand got real heavy, and if you go in a negative G, one day all the extra clips from the ammo that had fallen down all came up floating in front of my face. I just picked them all up and threw them over the side. But, it was a lot. Actually, that was a lot of fun compared to sitting there behind a typewriter all day long. And we just wrote with a pencil in our log there. And we had to change frequency. We had a freak meter in there too. You had to kind of get down between your knees and work this little freak meter, set up a new frequency, and we communicated between the planes with our hand signals. In other words, this was a dot, and that was a dash. So on the side of the plane, you go like that. See, that's the letter P. Okay, and that's our A was. That's the way you did it. Or numbers, you know. And that's how you'd tell the new frequency, and then you'd switch frequency to that and then get on air again. So we use visual with lights. So the ship could send a light signal to you, and you also had a signal light that you could key to send a signal to them with light, all for radio silence purposes. So you actually had three means of communication. Then when you're getting ready to come into land, they would display the flag, Abel Baker cast dog type flag, what kind of landing you were going to make. Now normally it was the cast recovery, which meant the ship made a turn to smooth out the ruffle in the water, but you still have those swells. And the pilot would come in and hit that first swell, crunch, then bounce along the next few, and then catch up with a sled. And then they'd swing the other way to pick up the other side. Only once did we ever do, I think it was a dog recovery, where the ship went straight ahead, never turned. The water was so smooth like glass, and we're landing two planes at once. Came in like this on both sides. It's kind of neat.
It's a big pontoon on the bottom, and
just a single pontoon with two wing floats out there to keep the wings from going under it. Yeah.
Wow.
So, but it was a lot of. It was, as you see in some of these pictures he's taking there. It was quite an operation. Well, anyway, we're doing all this. We went to we got a 90-day. Well, if you recall back in history, when they started that ABCD encirclement ring.
Not familiar with it.
American, British, China, and Dutch in August of 41. No more oil, no more nothing to Japan. Okay, that's when things started getting tender. And that's what they called ABCD encirclement ring. No more metal, no more oil for Japan. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of my story, but that put them in a tough shape because they had converted their Navy to oil. And they only had about, say, a 6-month supply. So they had to either give up or fight. Well, they had done so well in China, they thought, well, the warlord said yes. Tojo, etc., said yes. So that brought on the war. Which gets into another area I'll get into in a minute or two. But we did make a trip back in August, and we were there in Long Beach when that thing started, so everything got kind of, security got high in a hurry right there for a short time. It didn't last very long, but it did. And I got to get home for a couple of days there. And are we running out of tape?
Nope, you're good. I'm just making one adjustment there.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Oh,
I can keep an eye on
I didn't see myself down there. Oh, okay. Now I can get nervous. Anyway, on the way back out from San Pedro back to Pearl, this was in August, we were also with another heavy cruiser, the Portland, and we were getting ahead of a storm that was coming up, one of those late, in that area, I don't know if they call them typhoons or what, in that part of the country. They got hurricanes, typhoons, and what have you, and whatever. Anyhow, this storm is the one that develops and comes up the coast from out of Mexico area. And we were running ahead of that thing and doing well, and then all of a sudden there was a dredger being taken out on a, towed out there to Pearl on a barge, and they got in a storm and lost their tow, so they sent us back to find them. So when I woke up that morning, that ship was really bouncing around, and in fact, one of the screws was bouncing. When it would bounce in the air, you get that boom thing, and it was. So I got up and got dressed and went up, and I poked my head up into the hangar, got into the hangar and the ship was rocking quite violently, and got the hangar just in time to have a wall of water about 4 foot deep come over, and it took me underneath the workbench and turned me around so it went back the other way. So then I went over and was able to get up into the silo. That's what the catapult support, where we had all our radio equipment. Well, another Rave and I were up there trying to recover all our books. Everything on the shelves had all been tipped off, and it was a mess up there. And we were up there. We spent the rest of the storm up there, and it got pretty bad at times, because that well deck would be almost completely 10, 20 feet deep in water, because the waves are coming in from the side, everything like this, and washing. And we had a plane parked there on the sled, on a regular, on its carrier, and it was all bolted down with J-hooks, pretty tight. But the force of that water broke that sled loose and bashed that plane around. And it just about went over the side, but it didn't. All that was left after that thing was the engine and a bunch of fuselage, period. That was it. And when we brought the carcass into Pearl, they said, "Why don't you let's dump it over anyway?" So we had a lost plane. Well, every department put in a claim for all the equipment that they need that's supposed to be on that plane. The trouble was that the amount of stuff, the weight of all the stuff that was reported was about twice the weight of the plane. So now obviously they didn't all get it, but we did lose all our radio equipment in the plane and everything else. I did go out and save one souvenir. That's the plane I flew in. That was the relief tube. A little funnel when I cut it off.
That's one of the questions kids like to ask. Eventually they start talking and figuring out how long, and then finally they're like, "Wait a minute. So when you were up there, how'd you go to the bathroom and things?" So. Well,
that's what the relief tube was for, yeah. For the other thing, there was no relief for that I know of anyway. But you were sitting on it, I guess. Our seat was actually a parachute pack. And that was it, no cushion, just that hard pack. So when you bounced on those waves, you really felt it, your crunch, But we went we got back to Pearl, and that was in late August. So we continued to operate. The ship then went into the yard for overhaul, and they needed some wires. They had her pretty well torn apart in October, November, and into December. And so we were on Fort Island, which is right in the middle of the Pearl Harbor, set up there. We were still operating our 4 planes, so we're using water takeoff and landings right there at Pearl. And again, I mentioned those antennas with a 2-pound weight on the end of them. If you didn't remember to crank in your antenna before you landed, all of a sudden you feel a little kind of a snip, and you'd lose your weight, and you'd have to go down and draw another 2-pound weight out of the sea stores and hook it all up again. So I saw quite a few. I lost a couple during that time. You get so involved with everything else going on, you forget to wheel the darn thing in. You see a plane coming in and land, also you see a little splash behind the plane, you know what he did. But so we were doing our gunnery and everything like that, and in fact, about a day or so before the weekend, I guess before Pearl, Saturday morning, the pilot that I flew with came down and said, "Oh, you don't have to go out there. I'm going to take one of my friends along with me." one of his officer friends. I said, well, that's fine. So I put on there and put the parachute on, hooked them on, and everything like that. And when they came back from the flight, I climbed up the side of the plane as usual, and everything okay? He said, well, the intercom wouldn't work. I couldn't talk to my friend back there. So I pick up the mic, and I said, you test it? Yeah, it works fine. The guy says, oh. He reaches down, pulls up the relief tube. He'd been shouting in there like the old Gosport tube they used in their whole early days, you know. I thought that was priceless anyway. Oh, man. Anyway, that was, you know, we had a lot of humor, and even all the serious things we always thought we had a lot of fun. One serious thing we had, though, in regard to this target towing, we were supposed to drape the target over the, I call it the line that ran from the bow up to the foremast. Actually, that line is about cable about that big around with lots of insulators in it. We're supposed to drape our rope across there and then pull this and drop it there so they could recover the target. Well, we got there. I pulled the thing, and the D-hook it came apart, didn't work, so we couldn't get rid of that target. And I quickly told the pilot, so he put the plane in kind of a sideways skid to soften the blow, and that thing got up and wrapped around a couple times, and sure, the rope stretched out and then snapped. Now, that could have been dangerous. If that had jerked that thing out that's holding to the float, we would have crumpled up right there and dropped probably a couple hundred feet. That would have been the end of us. But so you have all kinds of narrow escapes at times, that all operational errors and things. So, but we lucked out, I guess. But well, came the fatal day of December 7. I was going to go ashore that day to see my relatives. I had one foot out of the bunk, and we heard a plane diving, and heard them pull out, and then we heard an explosion. Didn't think too much of it, because our own planes used to do that all the time. Then we looked over there, and we could see a little bit of sky between the barracks, and saw the smoke coming up. Just about that time, a Jap plane flew through that piece of sky. You could see that big red meatball on the side of it. Boom. Nobody lined us up to tell us that we were at war. We knew it. So I got dressed with dungarees, went down below. We were in about the second or third level of that barracks there on Fort Island. Went down to the main below, and I thought the chief master at arms had lost his brains. He used a big fire. We were breaking all the beautiful big plate glass windows. Well, obviously, you know, it was in case of an air hit, they didn't want all that glass flying, so he was out there breaking out those windows. So I went down toward the hangar there, and I heard some strafing going on, stuff zinging around. I ducked up alongside a building and said, well, get away from that for a minute. And then I realized that was a torpedo shop, which wasn't a very safe place to be either. Well, as soon as that strafing stopped, I got on down to our hangar to find that out of the 24 planes on the ramp that night, about half of them were damaged beyond use because a bomb had landed right at the head of the ramp there and sprayed them all with shrapnel and concrete and whatnot. So, and the other end of the hangar we were in is where those PBY were located. And they took a beating there too, because the Japanese didn't want us coming out and finding them, hopefully, you know. So, we started a routine there of building up ammunition, working on the planes, trying to repair what we could. Meantime, the raid was still going on. And then it kind of hit a little bit of a lull then, and one cruiser went out to start out to sea, and I can recall there was somebody up on the, way up on high one of the masts. Maybe it was still a civilian worker on there, I don't know, but he was really pounding away doing something, securing something as they went out. And then the battleship Nevada got underway, and she started out, and they really pasted her. I mean, you could just see it. The planes were coming in and were dropping their bomb just at mast top. You could see the bomb leave the plane, hit the deck, go through the deck even, and then explode. And I saw some guys two guys were helping a guy who had been injured, and a bomb came right down between them, and they disappeared just like that. So we saw lots of bad stuff that first hour or so. So many things happened. It was just hard to. We were just down at one end of the island. We didn't know that the Arizona had blown up, of course. But on my way down there, I had noticed those horizontal bombers that were up maybe 10,000 feet or so. I looked up and saw that formation of planes, and I saw their bombs leaving the plane. Now, that's something you don't realize you can see. But your eyes are so focused on that plane that when those bombs leave the plane, you see like little round periods, like dots, right next to the plane, then they disappear. Well, immediately, I figured, oh boy. Then I realized they're moving this way, so the bombs are going to go on over. And that was evidently one of those bombs that went down and hit the Arizona and blew it up, because that's what got her, was a horizontal bombing came and got her. And the first ship I saw when I came out of that barracks, the California, was already listing, and her bow was already sinking a bit there. So it was a devastation there, believe me. And as I said earlier, a couple of years ago, I participated in a film episode where they interviewed about 50 or 60 of us that had been at Pearl Harbor. And while we're talking, they're showing what's going on in the background. It's a three-hour tape, actually. It's three single tapes, and I ended up in all three of them. So we spent the rest of the day putting our planes back together and belting up ammunition, because the ammunition we had already had belted up was in a little building over there, and that building was on fire, and all that ammo was going off like firecrackers. So we had to build up new material, which we did.
How old are you at this point?
21.
You're still a kid.
Literally.
I mean, you've crossed over into that quote adulthood, but that's still pretty doggone young, really.
Oh yeah. Well, I was lucky in a way being young, you know what I mean? You go through this stuff. But there were a lot younger at that time. There could have been 17-year-olds. There were even some that were younger than that illegally. But I was almost 22, frankly, but a few months from that. But
was it? I mean, when you think about it, did it become chaos, or were you so well trained, or your mind takes over, that you could slow down the world or whatever? No, I need to do this, and
pretty
this.
much that, yes. I knew what we had to do, and we did. And we got all this ammunition belted up. And that night, I didn't know it, but during the day, some scouting planes came in from the Enterprise, the carrier. And she was the only carrier operating at that moment out there. And they came in during the raid, and I later met, some of those planes got shot down by our own friendly fire. Because, I mean, anything that moved in was fair game. Everybody was trigger happy, to say the least. But that night, some fighter planes were coming in from the Enterprise. And it was dark, a lot of smoke, clouds, fog, what have you. You couldn't see the planes. And the signal was that if the red light on the water tower was turned off, it was enemy. Well, some darn fool turned the light off. So the Pennsylvania over there in the dry dock, she took off and started the first, all of her 5-inch guns opened up right away. And then everybody cut loose. 50 caliber, 30 caliber, you name it. It was all just shooting up in the air. Well, several of those fighter planes were hit and crashed. And one of the fellows, though, that did come in later, he was able to miss that. He came in and landed, and he's on this Pearl Harbor, the real story tape I told you about. And right after I get through talking about that, he's the next person on the tape. That's how he is coming in, and he says, all hell broke loose. 5-inch, 3-inch, 1.1s, 50 caliber, 30 caliber, rocks, pipes, anything they could throw at us. He said, I almost hit the Nevada because it was beached over. It had gotten hit so bad, it went over and didn't try to go out. It beached itself right near there. He said, I almost hit the Ford Tower on that. But he said, I missed it. It came on and finally landed. As I was taxiing back to where we were supposed to taxi, they had a revetment there with a Marine in it, there with a 50 caliber machine gun, and he started shooting at me. All of a sudden, bullets were going around my head, boom, 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 like that. And he said, but it just happened that his commander was there, and he grabbed a rifle and hit this guy over the head with a rifle, but to slow him down a bit. I mean, all kinds of weird things happen like that. So, I should say one thing. I backed off here a little bit. Here I'm jumping ahead or back again.
That's fine.
We're talking about this while we're working on the planes here, and all this fighting was going on. Our aircraft guns were real active, and the old saying goes, "What goes up, got to come down." So I'm holding here a nose fuse from one of our own 5-inch anti-aircraft shells that went up, did its thing, and came down in one piece. The rest of the course, the shell was all shrapnel. And this being a good hunk of shrapnel, came down and smacked the pavement about 20 feet away from me. I went over to pick it up, and it was too hot yet. It's still warm, so I waited till it cooled off, and I still have it today. Lots of outfits been trying to talk this out of me, but I haven't let go of it yet. But it says inside here, you can read the fine stamping in here somewhere. It says Scoville Gunworks, 1917. Oh, wow. So it was actually made for World War I. But it still worked.
And that weighs a good couple of pounds.
It's no way. Well, I estimate maybe a pound at least, but it's all solid brass. But you can see the powder train in here where it went around. And here's where it finally came through. There's a hole here somewhere. There it is.
Oh, yeah.
And then it went around the powder train, then went around to here, and it started somewhere here. And on the ship, before they would fire these things, they put them in a gadget, and they would crank in the time delay they wanted, and by turning these things. And then when that thing was ignited, it would then burn that fuse around so long and then fire. That's how they determined the altitude to shoot, or how far out to go. So it was kind of crude, but it worked.
I was going to say, it's amazing to understand the ingenuity that went into a lot of the technology that we
Of
got.
course, this was, let's face it, this was World War I type stuff, you know?
Like you said, it worked.
Yeah.
That's the important thing.
In those days, they didn't have radar that would develop to that point. They were using visual optics, you know, to look at the range and everything, and how high and how far away and how fast. And in those days, the computers were all literally hand operated, turn cranks and things, and bells and whistles and what. And that would be setting on the mount. They had 4 places by each gun, and they would load these things and fire. Well, so anyway, the night ended finally. Next day, we had some of our planes back in order, so we went out on a search hop, you might call it, to see. Obviously, they were long gone, but they sent us out anyway. And that's the day they sent us down. We went down through all the Hawaiian Islands. We went down to from Oahu. We went on south and went down Molokai, Maui, the Big Island. Did the circle around them. At that time, there was a lot of activity there, lava coming down and hitting in the ocean, making a lot of steam and everything. And when we came back to Pearl, they developed a scheme there for security. No matter which direction you came into Oahu, you had to go the rest of the way around the island before you could come in and land at Ford Island, in our case. Well, we happened to come in just right at the entrance there. So we had to do the whole island, which was interesting, because as we looked down, we were flying there about 1,100 or 1,000 feet. Every gun, everything was looking at us. You were looking down the barrel of every rifle and any aircraft was going. They were all using it for spotting practice. So we survived that. Okay.
What was so that would have been when you left? You got your first aerial view of Pearl.
The day after, yeah.
Yeah.
This was on the 8th.
What was that like?
Well, there was still a lot of fire, a lot of smoke going on from all the burning and everything, and it was just utter. Well, you've seen the pictures. I've got lots of books with pictures. It's just, everything was like the Pennsylvania and a couple of destroyers in the dry dock were all beat up. The destroyers were actually practically done away with. The Shaw in the floating dry dock, when she blew, that's that famous picture you see with all the big explosion. Well, I saw that from just across the water, and pieces of that ship were raining down around us, pieces of this, pieces of that, and that sort of thing. And there was about 30 in our division here, and why none of our 30 got hit with anything, which is fortunate. I saw one guy there that had been strafed. He had 4 bullet holes right across his belly, and they were loading him into an ambulance. He was still walking, but he earned 4 Purple Hearts that day.
Was it a reality to you, or does your mind check out and it became this kind of surreal?
Well,
did it put fear in you? I mean, what goes through your head at this point?
at that moment, you didn't have time to stop and think about it. Later, you think about, oh my God, this could have happened or that could have happened, but it didn't. But we were still alive. That's the main thing, I guess. Well, they put our ship back together in a hurry, and we got underway, and we went out with a task force of the carrier, a few other cruisers and destroyers, and I don't recall the names of any of them, and about 6 transport loaded with Marines and supplies to try and relieve Wake Island. Well, unfortunately, they took over on the 23rd. We were actually a day away, but in a way now it's fortunate because at that time they outnumbered us probably 3 to 1 in every category, and we would have been probably all lost if we had tangled with them at that moment. So we came back and we left all of our supplies at Midway, which turned out to be a good thing a little later on. And we were down there on Christmas Day. We were straddling the date line. That's the day before Christmas. No, it's the day after. Back and forth, sort of thing. Finally, he said, okay, we'll stay on one side. Now it's Christmas. Serve chow. So we had our normal holiday, which in those days turned out to be turkey and all the trimmings. So we did okay on that, sure. We got back to Pearl, and they finished putting us together. When they put us together, we weren't quite lined up yet. Something in one of our turbines was giving us that old bumping all the time, so they worked on that while we were in there for a few days. And then we left again there early in January, and we went south, and our first duty we did was we were stuck with the duty of protecting Pango Pango, American Samoa. So we cruised around there for 3 whole weeks. Meantime, they were doing some other action thing, and our skipper wanted to get into action in a hurry. And he kept pulling for it. Finally, after about 3 weeks, we did join a task force down near the New Hebrides and headed over toward what later became the Guadalcanal area. But he was quite a skipper. Callahan was his name, and he would give us a pep talk every so often, and he would always end up his speech. Now, this is politically incorrect today, of course, as they say, but he said, a good Jap is a dead Jap. Everybody would hooray, sort of thing, because he was getting us all hepped up for it. Well, he became admiral later on, actually, but that's another story when... Well, let me continue with that then. San Francisco was involved in a few other things, but before that happened, we joined up with another carrier, and we were heading up to Rabaul, which the Japs were just taking over, and we're going to give them a pasting. But we were detected by one of those Japanese 4-engine big flying boats, the Kamanishi types, and sure enough, late that afternoon, a whole bunch of bombers came out. I think they started out with 18, I believe 17 finally came over. Well, our fighter planes up there, the F-4F Grummons, were doing their thing, And then they got them real close, and the aircraft opened up on them. But my duty station was there on the well deck with the planes. We're ready to, since the planes each had about 110 gallons of gasoline on board, we were prepared to fly them off to avoid that having all that gasoline around. So we were revved up ready to operate. So actually, I looked up and witnessed Butch O'Hara, who you may know became famous later. He made his ace there in about 4 minutes. He knocked down 5 of those bombers in 5 minutes, and his guns were even not all working correctly. Some of them were not firing or sick or something, but he did manage to knock 5 planes down there in those few minutes. And we could see them all coming down, one right after the other. Well, one of those planes wasn't hit that bad. It went over us, and all of our guns were opening up on them. And that's where I just about lost my hearing, because didn't have any earplugs in those days. And with all those 5 of his guns going off, all that gun cotton packing was coming down all over the deck. Like, I went around and picked up a bunch of that stuff and rolled up and stuffed it in my ears. I still have a hole in my eardrum on this side, which today is useful because when I go flying, I don't have to. I don't get that pressure buildup in my ears. It leaks through. Well, anyway, those planes almost did get one of the carriers because they straddled her. All of a sudden, she was just hidden with all that smoke and from the water flying up from those bombs. But they straddled her, but they missed her. And when she came out from that cloud of smoke and stuff, man, it was a good sight to see. But this one plane, though, was trying to crash dive on her, came down right between our ships. We were shooting at it, and they were shooting at it, and their shells were hitting our ship, the 50 caliber stuff, and actually penetrated partway through our siding there. We had, say, 3/8 inch or ½ inch steel, and those bullets came about halfway through. You pull them out, there was daylight. But we survived that. So we decided then, okay, we gave up on that idea, so we went up behind the New Guinea Peninsula there. And that was interesting in a way because there were a lot of coral heads that were built up from the sea. And they were high enough that some of them our ships would have hit them. So that's the case where they had our scouting planes flying ahead of the task force. And we were marking every one of those coral heads with a smoke float. That smoke would run about 5 minutes, so they'd plot them and then they'd dodge them and miss them, all right? So next morning early, we got way up in there. They launched all the planes from the carriers, and they went overland and came down and caught the Japanese when they were landing there at Salamoa and Lae, and did quite a bit of damage to them there, transports and a few other ships. And then they came back and landed, and as soon as they landed, we got the heck out of there. Now that's the time when our plane landed too fast, overran the sled, knocked the tow line knocked off the float, the plane turned over and sank. The guys were rescued and came back, so that's when that occurred. Now, it turned to be night, but we reversed course, and the navigators knew the course to follow, how many turns, how many this, and so this whole task force got out of there without hitting any of those coral heads that night. It was dark night, no moon that night, I remember. Now, another interesting thing happened at that point. The day before we got there, one of our search planes from our ship got lost. The task force made a turn and they didn't catch it. They were behind a cloud or something. And we went out to relieve them about 2 in the afternoon, and they weren't there. We went to this side where the other group of planes were searching, gave them the hand signal for so-and-so, question mark. They hadn't seen him. Went the other side, they hadn't seen him. So we went back to the ship and sent a message where we used another method of communication was we would drop a message by the sandbag. We had a little envelope made up out of canvas. They'd have maybe a ½ pound of sand in it. And you'd write the message up, seal it in there, and tie it up, and then you'd come in real close to the ship, and you'd try to throw that down the stack. Well, they would curve around and come in and land on the ship. And they had everybody on board looking for it to try and stop it. Well, I saw one hit the deck, and it just kept going like it was going about 100 mile an hour, literally. And the guys were trying to stop it. You know, they missed it, went over the side. So if you saw that happen, then you had to give them a negative message. So I just wrote out the message, CSC 15 missing. So we dropped that message. And then we went back on duty out there. We're doing well. I came back, found out that the admiral, the task force commander, had allowed the ship to make one quick message. So they called this plane, and they ran a quick direction finder thing on it. Found out that he was maybe 100 miles away, and he was out of fuel. So obviously he was going to land in the water. Okay. When we got through with that raid, on our way back, that next morning, our sector was ahead of the group again, looking, and I noticed one of the carrier dive bomber planes was doing some funny things out there, and it was in our sector. So we zoomed over there, and by God, it was our plane, floating, still floating. A lot of the fabric was pretty well torn off of it, but the pilot Thomas and the radioman Gannon was waving at us, everything. So we went right straight back to the ship, dropped that message again. And that's one case where I really hit the bull by the horns, because the signal officer, which was on the bridge just below the main bridge, there's an opening there, and he was holding his clipboard, and that damn message came in and hit that clipboard and broke it. Well, the ship instantly turned and went over to pick them up. And they got the engine started again. They got it and cranked her up, and they had that thing running so they could taxi up, so the ship didn't have to come to a complete stop. Well, we had to finish our 2 or 3 hours out there and came back, and then got to talk to him. And that pilot never did figure out how he had goofed up and lost somehow. I don't think he ever figured it out. Anyhow, we were back together again. But now the reason why we did that is the navigator on the Enterprise, I believe, calculated drifting, winds conditions, and everything else, and figured out about where that plane would be. So they directed our force to go that area. And by God, we got them. And that was 3 days after they went down. So
wow,
it was kind of an interesting thing. Anyway, we got back to, after that we went back toward, we were pretty well shot. We had been out to sea about 65 days by that time. And the way they refuel us, the tankers would come up alongside, they'd get hooked up, and they'd get the oil lines and gasoline lines and whatnot draped between the ships. So they'd be feeding us, and we'd have a destroyer or so off on the other side, we'd be feeding them. And that's when the mail would come aboard, everything like that. So that's quite an operation. At one time, that was a very secret thing, because they didn't want the enemies to know how we did all this sort of thing. Well, make a long story short, we were running low on everything. So they let us stop off.
I'm going to have you hold for just a second.
Yeah, go ahead.